Hi, everybody. It's Steph and Christina. Hope you're doing well. It is Sunday, the 10th of September, 11:41 a.m., almost the crack of noon. And Christina and I were having a chat, and she actually said, "Gee, I wish we were recording this because you're so right in everything that you're saying, and I want to have a permanent record of that." And was that sort of the idea? Anyway, so what happened was we were chatting about, in response to a post on the board about forgiveness and about sort of the question of forgiveness and when it is appropriate and so on. And now Christina's background is in cognitive therapy, which I have a huge amount of respect for, but we were sort of looking at the limits of what occurs with people when trauma happens to them. And I sort of have the contention that, and I sort of made the statement that got Christina in fine debating form. I sort of made the statement that we don't own our feelings, that we own our values. Sort of the model that we're working with is that we own our values so we can work to change what we consider to be the good, sort of trying to figure out a more consistent and logical argument for morality and so on, that we own our values. But even our values, of course, we inherit from our parents, right? I mean, we were owned by our parents for, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years, or perhaps longer if they're paying for university. So we are owned by our parents, and we inherit their values. Their values, I guess you could say, are inflicted upon us in a way that's not very good. And so we don't own our own values. We inherit our values from our parents, much in the same way that we would inherit a genetic ailment from our parents, or we would inherit a kind of ill health situation based on something like if they had underfed us, then we would end up growing up stunted, and we would then have to own the effects of that, and so on. So when we're an adult, our values are inflicted upon us by school and community and by our parents, and we inherit our values. We don't create our values. We inherit them.
And we internalize them.
We internalize them for sure. And so one of the examples that I was sort of trying to give about the fact that we don't own our emotions is if I sort of grab you, not you, but you, and dangle you over the edge of a building, then you're going to feel the adrenaline rush. Your pupils will dilate, your hands will get sweaty, your heart will start hammering. And to me, that's, it's exactly the same as if I had injected you with a large amount of an artificial stimulant or even natural adrenaline. If I had injected you with those things, then I would own the effects within your own body, right? I would be causally responsible for creating those feelings within, or that experience within your own body. Now, the question then became was the question of self-ownership of emotions, and I was sort of saying that other people are pretty causally directly responsible for your feelings, and Christina felt that was incomplete.
No, I didn't actually feel that it was incomplete. I think what I actually was reacting to was that you said other people own your emotions, and I don't think that other people own your emotions. And through the debate that we had, and we were talking for a good half hour before we decided to record this, I like the conclusion that we came to that we condition our own emotions, and that our emotions are the result of sort of what I think you said was a collision. I like that. A collision between an external event or possibly an internal event, such as a memory or a physiological response, and our core beliefs, which are these values that were inflicted upon us, that we internalized over time. So I still disagree with you that other people own your emotions. I think your emotions are your own. I think it's our each and everyone's responsibility to be clear on what their values are, to look for truth, to look for honesty, to be clear on these values so that then they can have, clear, effective emotions in response to external or possibly even internal triggers.
If you don't mind, let's stay with the external ones for now. So, If I do dangle you over the edge of a building, then am I causally responsible for the resulting adrenaline rush?
Okay, so you're holding me over a building.
Yeah, I've got you by the feet, and I'm hanging you off the edge of a building, and of course you're terrified and you're.
Absolutely. I mean, you are responsible, of course. Now, I'm gonna feel whether or not we're playing, and there's a trampoline underneath me, and it's only we're only 10 feet off the ground. There's still gonna be some autonomic response there. My adrenaline's gonna start pumping, and I'm gonna have
Let's just say
sort
it's
of
a high building, and I'm scaring you.
And you're scaring me. You're really threatening to drop me. I'm going to be terrified. You're
absolutely
responsible for my fear in that moment.
I mean, in that sense, it's sort of indistinguishable from me having just sort of injected you with some stimulant, right? If I inject you with some sort of stimulant, then you're not causally responsible for the resulting emotional state, right?
No, if something goes into my body, that's biological how my body is going to respond.
Right. So, if that's the case, then I'm not sure what the difference would be. And we're talking about an extreme situation, I'm aware of that. I'm not sure what the difference would then be between me hanging you off the edge of a building, me injecting you, or, we also used an example of if I sort of rush at you with a knife, then you're going to get the fight or flight, you're going to get the adrenaline and so on. I'm directly causing those feelings within your system.
You're causing them, but you don't own them. I take exception to the word owning.
Okay. If I, and again, this is a little bit convoluted, but it's very important when it comes to the idea of forgiveness. So, if I inject you with adrenaline using a needle, you're asleep. I mean, again, we just make these stuff up to try and find the limit of the theory. So, if I inject you in your sleep with adrenaline, right, then the ownership, obviously I own that action, and I own the stuff that I'm putting into you.
Yes.
Right? Now, does the transfer of ownership, because it's now in your body, does the transfer of ownership then accrue to you, and it's now your property, and it's now your responsibility, and you own that?
You see, with a substance, yeah, I mean, see, the difference between emotions and physiological reactions is that physiological reactions are autonomic, or automatic, and with emotions, everything needs to be tempered, or it needs to be processed through our core beliefs, those internalized values, which may or may not be accurate. So when a poison enters my body, which is functioning properly, is going to respond to that poison. Mm-hmm. Because it recognizes as a poison. It's gonna, I don't know what happens, white blood cells.
Yeah, you get antibodies.
Antibodies, what have you, right? So that's an automatic process.
Right.
And I don't think there's anything that intervenes. I don't think there's anything that intervenes the way it does with emotional responses.
Okay, I think that's perfectly fair. So, where the possibility of choice in evaluation comes up, then you have a situation where values come into play. I fully agree with that, for sure. But when I say that you don't own your emotions, you do own your values, and you're responsible to fight your way to clear values so that you can have more accurate emotional responses to what's coming at you from the outside world.
I completely agree.
But I would say that that's the only control that you have over your emotions is figuring out your values and trying to live by them consistently. But you don't have any control over, and we used a metaphor which I think is helpful here. Christina is lactose intolerant, and for a number of years she didn't recognize that she was lactose intolerant, just that she'd get kind of grippy and so on. And so you didn't have any control over what happens. You don't have any control over what happens when lactose enters your system, but you do have control over whether you go and drink a quart of milk.
Yes, I do.
So, recognizing that you don't have control over the reaction will change your behavior. If you thought it was a matter of willpower, if you said, okay, well, I can have this piece of cheesecake. Cheesecake. If you said, well, I can have... Sorry, go ahead.
It's just been years since I've had cheesecake.
I'm sorry, let's just take a short break as Christina gathers her thoughts and her emotions back together, because obviously I'm now responsible for the vociferous amounts of drool coming out of her mouth. But, so you are, if you thought that it would be a matter of willpower or virtue to to manage the response that your body has to lactose, then your behavior wouldn't alter nearly to the degree that if you said, okay, I can't own the response of my body. It's not my responsibility how my body responds to lactose. It's my responsibility to get lactose, like to prevent lactose from entering my system.
Right, and the problem that I have with the lactose example is that, again, we're talking about physiology versus emotions.
But we certainly know about the autonomous nervous system that there is an enormous amount of physiology involved in the production and experience of emotions, right?
Absolutely, but if you've convinced yourself, like a child who grows up in an abusive situation, an abusive environment, learns that this is normal, so becomes desensitized to abusive situations and therefore no longer has the autonomic responses.
Yeah, I mean, that I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
Or they're tempered, or they're less, or I'm not sure.
They're repressed,
or they're
I think
repressed,
would be, right?
yeah.
So they're still occurring, it's just that you're willing yourself not to feel them.
This is what I'm saying. You are tempering your responses by your values.
Well,
So you own the responses. No, the other person doesn't.
Okay, so if that's the case, then if you own the response that you have to a traumatic situation, if you end up repressing your feelings, and if that's the result of values, right, then we should not see that behavior in pre-value consciousness, right? So a child of 5 who obviously cannot reflect and form his or her own values should not experience or should not exhibit signs of repression or dissociation. Like, if it's not an autonomous nervous system response to excessive fear and pain to shut down the responses, the autonomic nervous system responses to those stimuli, if that itself is not an autonomous nervous system response, then we shouldn't see it in people who are pre-rational consciousness, or in children. But it seems to me that we do see that quite often in children who've gone through a lot of trauma, that they will exhibit signs of dissociation and extraordinary levels of non-emotionality. We can also see this like in a cat. I mean, if you study the sort of the nervous system of a cat, as of course I spent a good deal of my 20s doing, if you study the emotional, or if you study the nervous system of a cat, when you start a bell ringing, then the cat's nervous system will stimulate, the auditory nervous system will stimulate the mind saying there's a bell ringing. But if you leave the bell ringing, and we all have this experience with a continual noise, you just stop hearing it, right? So the stimuli that's reaching your mind is being dampened because of its persistence, because it's not providing any new information, because there's
desensitization.
Desensitization. So if somebody is experiencing a lot of trauma, they're going to end up with desensitization, which is an autonomous nervous system response to an excessive amount of stimuli of one kind or another. It's just to dampen it down, right?
That's a very fair analysis. Yeah, I hadn't quite thought of it that way.
So the question around whether or not we have causal responsibility even for dissociation when it's an autonomous nervous system response, I think is blurred, let's just say, right? And people who then, as adults, start to change their value system are going to have to, you've got to go through and re-experience the trauma. It's not like the trauma goes away because you repress it, right? Any more than if you take morphine, your cancer disappears, right? The experience of it disappears, but the actual trauma or problem remains. As people who've tried that, it doesn't work out very well, right? It's a good cash cow for you, I guess we could say. So if we are dealing with an autonomous nervous system response in the realm of adrenaline or fear or dissociation, then I think because it is an autonomous nervous system response, it's hard to say that we have ownership over it in that way. Now, values, I think, have some component of an autonomous nervous system response in that children, when they're exposed to a lot of trauma, will almost inevitably try to normalize it and repress it. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
So, in order to normalize and repress an excess of trauma, the autonomous nervous system, which I do believe, and this is all, not proven, the CAT scan's coming tomorrow, but the autonomous nervous system can reach all the way up to the values, right? And we know that because when you look at philosophers who have particular theories, and I don't think you heard the podcast on John Stuart Mill, but that the highest levels of ideation or idealization or highest levels of philosophical abstractions we have can sometimes arise directly out of, and it seems to me quite often would arise directly out of childhood trauma. So the defense mechanism that the adult mind wraps around the childhood trauma is to abstract, for certain types of people, not for everyone, but just about everyone normalizes their childhood experiences and idealizes the behavior to some degree or another, or minimizes it, or says, oh, my parents weren't that bad, or they did the best they could, or they took care of me in a lot of ways, they just couldn't do this, that, or the other, even if they can get that far. So what happens is the autonomous nervous system has A, experienced an enormous amount of trauma, has B, wrapped all of that trauma in a kind of emotional void, and then C, particularly for people with an intellectual bent, has manufactured values to justify that. So in none of these situations, I think, is the person taking direct ownership or able to take direct ownership for
But they take direct ownership for, and this is, you said, has manufactured values.
Yes.
You think that's an autonomic nervous system response? I think that's a cognitive response. I think that is a willed response.
So, okay. So then people who have experienced emotional trauma as children, right? They were beaten by their father, who then grow up to have theories about God, or like stuff which is directly traceable back to that. I mean, for any astute psychologist, you can see if the person grows up with in fear and having fear, respect, and love, all this tangled, Patty Hearst Stockholm syndrome stuff with the deity. If a person grows up and has this fear, respect, and love for a God, which any astute psychologist would directly trace back to the fear and sort of quote love and respect that they were forced to have for their father when they were a child, that the person has consciously decided, well, my dad was a bad guy, so I'm going to invent this God to normalize that behavior.
Oh, that's complicated. I don't know that I can comment on that. I need to really think about that.
Oh, sweetie, sorry, this is a free domain radio podcast. We don't do that.
But you and I are just having a discussion.
Oh, right, sorry. Not a podcast yet. But, I mean, you've...
That's really interesting.
I mean...
Give me a second to think about that.
And while you're thinking about it, I'll continue to ramble on. Just because if you think about the people that we know in our lives who have theories about the world, and everybody has theories about the world, that's involuntary, right? We are abstract making machines. We are meaning making, story making machines. The people that we know who have theories about the world have theories about the world that we can directly trace back to their childhood experiences. I mean, right. I think that's fairly common.
Core beliefs about ourselves, other people in the world, or the universe.
Right, and let's use the phrase core beliefs because that's more sort of in the cognitive therapy mold. So the core beliefs that people have seem to form around the experiences of their childhood. So we've talked about nurses before, right? And nurses end up taking care of people and being there for people and, wiping the poop from their pants and stuff like that. And a lot of people who end up as nurses started out in life being sort of substitute parents for younger siblings, taking care of alcoholic or dissociated parents, or becoming sort of early caretakers prior to really having the emotional tools to be able to do so. And a lot of the people who end up in these sort of helping professions have been taught that they exist to serve others and so on. Now, when you stop a nurse and say, why are you a nurse, right? She's not going to say, because I had to take care of my 14 younger brothers from the age of 6, and this is what I do, right? I'm just recreating my childhood trauma, but now at least I'm getting paid for it, right? She's going to say, I like to help people. It's good to help people. I'm a helping kind of person, right? So that aspect of consciousness that takes trauma, both normalizes and idealizes it, seems to be so universal that I've got to think that's a pretty automatic response. And again, I'm not trying to use determinism or we're all programmed. I'm just trying to say what I see. I'm just trying to work from sort of what I see in the world, which is that everybody has these theories about life and about the world and ethics and all that seem to be a direct defense mechanism for what they experienced as children, right? I mean, this sort of argument for morality that I've been rambling on for the last, 10 months or 8 months, is that we take our trauma and we wrap it in idealization. And that seems to be a pretty automatic response. I mean, that's sort of, when you hear people talk about the world, almost always they're talking about their own history, and they're abstracting it and normalizing it and making it virtuous, whatever it is that they end up doing, right? So a friend of mine's actually not a friend anymore. His father is a high school principal, and he says public school is the best thing ever, right? And of course, there's going to be and he's very patriotic and all that kind of stuff, and that's a problem, of course, because if he were to sort of understand that the root of the high school system or the public school system is violence and coercion and so on, and his dad's kind of like a minion for the state, that would be emotionally painful for him, right? And it's only emotionally painful for him because he already knows it, right? Because if he genuinely didn't know it, he'd be curious about, right? Curiosity is what happens when we genuinely don't know. Defenses is what occurs when we do know but don't want to admit it to ourselves, right? So this guy's philosophy is very much focused on justifying and normalizing the school system that his father is involved in, and his parents, and the fact that nobody ever told him all the violence that his father is sort of embedded in, and so on. And this, we could come up with dozens of examples about this, but there just seems to be an enormous amount of effort that goes into people justifying and abstracting into a virtue their traumatic experiences. Now, again, I'm not saying that they can't change that. But the first thing that you have to recognize, like with your own example of lactose intolerance, and I know it's stretch going from lactose intolerance to abstract philosophy, but we're pretty limber here at Free Domain Radio, stretches we can do. But the first thing that you have to recognize is you're not in control of what happens when you eat lactose or drink lactose. That you're not in control of that. So what you need to do, by recognizing that you don't own that physical response, it's autonomous, that the first thing you need to do is recognize that you can't control it, because if you recognize that you can't control it, then you're going to change your behavior, right? Because if you can't control the results of lactose intolerance, then you can't have, believe it or not, this is actually coming right back to forgiveness, right? This is sort of where we've been going. If you recognize that if people do bad things to you, you can't control your emotional responses to them, then you're going to get those people out of your life as surely as if you recognize that drinking lactose is going to make you sick.
But you can see, some people will try to...
I was so close.
I know, but I had to just respond to this. Some people will try to control their emotional responses. They'll try to use values, quote unquote.
Yeah, it's good to forgive.
Right? It's good to forgive. This person is, a parent, a relative, a close friend since childhood, a teacher, whatever. And I know that their intentions weren't, they didn't know any better. They do all these things. They impose these values.
Sure.
Unlike the lactose. I mean, I can stop using the lactose because I feel the ill effects, but if I try to, I can't stop myself from feeling the ill effects of ingesting lactose. But people will try to stop the ill effects, will not pay attention to the irritation, to the frustration, to the dissociation that they will experience when they may keep these people in their lives.
Absolutely. And they do that by thinking that they have some control over their emotions. Direct control over their emotions, right? That what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, every time I go to my parents' place, they dangle me over the edge of a building. But they're my parents, and so I have to find some way to make that enjoyable. And of course, you can't make being dangled over the edge of a building enjoyable. You can't make being disrespected, being scorned, having your beliefs ridiculed.
But you are responsible for understanding that you are responsible for your own emotions. They do not own your emotions. You do. As long as you continue to deny things or to put value judgments on things, not basing things in reality. Or by saying, or even if you do look at things in reality, then you can say, you know what, my instincts are correct. I own these feelings and I'm going to respond appropriately. These people are dangling me over a building. Every time I go over, they dangle me over a building. I'm responsible. I feel these feelings. I'm not going to do any. I'm not going to allow this to happen any longer. They don't own it. I own it.
Okay, and this is good. I mean, and we should definitely hash this one out because we have different opinions, which means that I'm wrong, but I don't know why exactly yet. So be patient with me.
You mean I'm right?
No. Yeah. Babe, you're my wife. Of course you're right. There's no question about it. It's just a matter of me figuring out what my error is, right? I mean, that's always a challenge, right? And I'm not going to fake it because, as you said the other day, you don't like that. So, okay, and so the sort of the argument that I'm making is that the stories that people make up to justify what happens to them is autonomous nervous system response. Human beings automatically abstract and justify what goes on for them and make it a virtue, whatever happens to them, right? So if your parents are really mean to you, and you know this from your practice, right? If your parents are really mean to you and they put you down and they this and they that, then people will say that it's virtuous for me to be nicer to my parents than they are to me, right? So I'm nicer to my parents than they are to me, right? And you had this a little bit with your own parents, where it's like, yes, I'm deeper and I have, more understanding and more education, but it's nice for me to go over there and see them, even if I don't really enjoy the interaction or even feel present in the interaction. You made that into a virtue. That's the only reason that you would go and see people who cause you pain, right? The only reason that you would go and see people who cause you pain is because you think it's virtuous. And the transformation of pain into virtue is automatic, autonomous. I'm just looking at the world. I mean, I'm just sort of reading from people I've known and what we know about culture and so on, that in the Greek community, and this is not just the Greek community, but just about every community, in the Greek community, there is a lot of vanity, there is child abuse, there is sending kids to Sunday school, there is be proud that you're Greek, there is spanking is accepted, in fact, required by some families. And this is all translated into a kind of civic pride and civic virtue by children and then by adults, and it's universal. I mean, there is such a thing as a Greek identity because it's such a universal thing that people transform their trauma into virtue, right? If you look across the whole world, look at the Muslim communities, the trauma is always, we're better because, right? We're better because we're different, and what happened to me as a child in terms of conformity and abuse and control, all of that makes me a virtuous person, makes me better than everyone else. It's like the whole world is my abuse is better than your abuse, right? That's the whole world, is everybody championing and flags and songs and marches and military and gods is all saying my abuse is better than your abuse. Your abuse is bad, my abuse is good, right? I mean, it's the wars of abuse and value that is the human experience these days, I think. And so it seems to me, because it's so universal, and because it happens to just about everybody who's not like who's got a functioning mind, it seems that it's as autonomous a nervous system response as a reaction to lactose. Now, it's not to say that you can't intervene, right, and change your behavior. For sure, you can. But you can't change that bad things make you feel bad. You can tell yourself that they're good. You can do this and that. You can tell yourself that when you take lactose, you are going a trial by God that's going to get you into heaven, but you still can't change that bad things make you feel bad.
Okay. I was thinking about the dangling the child over the building. What's the frightening thing about that?
About being dangled over a building?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that there's two components to what makes that frightening. The first component is it doesn't matter who's doing it.
Right.
Right? Because some random guy just grabs you and dangles you off a building, you're going to feel terrified. But the most frightening thing for people, what's overwhelming for children, is that it's their parents that are doing it.
Well, no, I'd say something else. I mean, you're looking at who's doing it. I'm looking at what is the fearful stimulus. The fearful stimulus is being hung over, over the edge of a building that is hundreds of feet high. So it's the fear of falling.
Actually, it's the fear of hitting.
Oh, it's the fear of hitting.
No, it's true. I mean, people
right?
aren't afraid of heights for falling, but of hitting and dying, right?
Right. So we've got the fear of, I don't know where I'm going with this, so bear with me. We've got the...
Hey, trust me, baby, it can produce great things.
Or maybe nothing at all.
I'm sure it will.
So, I'm not afraid of, I'm afraid of the falling, right? That's what's causing my adrenaline to pump,
yeah.
Right? And maybe by association, since it's my parents who dangle me, I now become afraid of my parents.
Sure. And you've got another 10 years to go.
It's the falling that is akin to the lactose.
Okay.
So it's like the lactose entering my system is like me actually falling off a building.
Okay.
And I don't know why that's important, but I sense that it's different.
Because there's a choice, right?
Right.
You could talk your way out of the situation of getting dangled off a building. The guy says, give me $10 and I won't let you fall. And you say, great, here's $10. He lifts you off. So you can intervene. I fully understand. You can intervene in a way with other human beings to modify their behavior based on acceding to their demands, right? I mean, in all of our childhoods, when we get these irrational demands from our parents, the way that we avoid violence is we comply, right? You can't comply with lactose and have it not hurt you, right? You can't say to lactose, oh, here's $10, don't give me a reaction, right? But with your parents, if they get mad at you for not going to church, you can just go to church, right? If they're going to hit you for not going to church or yell at you or frighten you.
That's them dangling me, right?
Yeah, you can then just say, okay, well, I'll comply with whatever it is that you want.
And you won't dangle me.
And you won't dangle me. Absolutely. I totally understand that. I'm not saying that you can't. Sorry, go ahead.
So they don't own my responses. I own my responses.
No, you can manage.
The physiological response, the adrenaline pumping, the fight or flight response, the autonomic nervous system with the adrenaline and the serotonin and all of that stuff is happening to being dangled over to the height, different, the fear of falling, which is the real threat.
Right.
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 I can't temper that. I'm being held over a cliff or over the edge of a building.
Right.
That's scary.
Yes.
I can't change that.
No.
Okay, that's autonomic.
Yeah.
What can I see? I need to get this. I need to get this.
What can I change?
What can I change? And so there's a difference. There's something there. There's something for me that I just.
What I'm saying. Let me try it this way. What I'm saying is that if you think that you can manage your feelings about being dangled off a cliff edge or a building edge, then you can't.
You shouldn't. That is a fearful trigger.
Right. If you think that you can manage those feelings, then you're going to be much more susceptible to being hung over bridges or buildings or cliffs in the future. Right? If you think that you can will or change your feeling or learn to enjoy the pain of lactose intolerance, you're going to be far more likely to eat cheesecake in the future. But if you say, there's nothing that I can do to make this a pleasurable experience, it's bad for me, it's dangerous, it's painful, it's unpleasant.
That's why you own your feelings.
Absolutely. And I think probably what we're doing is we're using feelings in two different contexts here. The one feeling in lactose intolerance is the gas, the pain, the doubled over, the agony, and so on, right? Now, you can't change that. You can't will that away. Right?
No, it's good. My body is saying this is not good for you.
Right. So you can't, in a sense, you don't own those feelings. Like you can't change or affect them, right? Mm-hmm. What you can do is by recognizing that you don't own the feelings of lactose intolerance, is you can say, I now have to stop drinking lactose. Because I can't manage or own, I guess I could manage them like I could take, painkillers or something, morphine. But that's for tonight, right? So that's a little different. But once you recognize, you say, okay, well, I can't conceivably own these, I can't control the responses to lactose. The only thing I can do is control my exposure to lactose. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So recognizing that there's two levels of ownership here. The first level is non-ownership of the pain of lactose intolerance.
That is a completely biological response.
Right. Now, although, if you want
just like being dangled over a building is a completely biological response.
Right. And so what I'm saying is that you don't own those feelings in the way that you own your desire not to experience those feelings, right? So you didn't, as soon as you found out, oh, I'm lactose intolerant, you stopped drinking lactose, right? Mm-hmm. So you then can manage or control those feelings by avoiding the stimuli. But you can't manage or control your feelings if you continue to be exposed to the stimuli. And if you think you can, you will continue to expose yourself to the stimuli. Right? Once you accept that it's totally out of your control what happens when you drink lactose, then you will stop drinking lactose.
Yes.
So once you accept that you don't own your reaction to lactose intolerance, it's not yours to control, you can't manage it, you can only avoid the stimuli. Does that make sense? So what you're talking about is the desire to avoid the stimuli, to not experience pain and so on, which I totally agree we have some control over. Although, of course, for a lot of people, and this is where ownership and responsibility, because of the amount of trauma and abuse in the world, becomes complicated, people who are brought up to be there for others, to have no needs of their own, to repress all feelings, and so on, that's inflicted on them, right? Like if your parents inject you with sugar, you're going to end up with adult onset diabetes, or maybe even childhood onset diabetes, and you own that, right? But you can't say, well, I can manage what happens when I eat a chocolate cake, right? You can't. You don't own that response because you've got diabetes, right? But you can own not eating chocolate cakes. Now, to get this back to forgiveness, the danger of forgiveness in this world, in this realm, is that if you think that you can manage or control or ameliorate or have some sort of causal control over the feelings that arise when you're around bad people, then that's a mistake. Because I'm saying you don't have control over those feelings. You want to accept those feelings, and you want to modify your values and get rid of the illusion of the virtue of family, and you want to...
And that's how you own those feelings, by being truthful, by allowing the truth to guide your instincts.
Okay, and maybe what we'll do is we'll just try switching the word ownership to responsibility. You are responsible for recognizing that getting dangled over a building is bad, and to avoid it.
Yes.
Right? But you are not responsible for feeling frightened when you're dangled over a building. Because that's autonomous, right?
That's autonomous. In fact, that's a good thing.
Well, I mean, good or bad, you're not responsible for feeling frightened when you're dangled over a building edge, right? It would take an extraordinary sociopathic dissociation to not be frightened when faced with imminent death.
Yes.
Right? So you're not responsible for the fear, the accelerated heart rate, the serotonin, the adrenaline, all of the biological responses that accrue to risk. Right? You're not responsible for those feelings. That's autonomous. You are responsible for evaluating those feelings accurately and honestly and accepting that you're not responsible for them. Because once you accept that you're not responsible for the fear of being dangled over a building edge, then you can place the responsibility for that fear where it belongs, which is where?
You can place the responsibility for that fear. I have to pull apart that sentence. You can place...
Who is causally responsible? If I force feed you lactose, who is responsible for the pain that results?
Ooh, you're good.
Oh, thank you, baby.
If you force feed me lactose, you're responsible for feeding me lactose, but my body is responsible for responding to that.
No. Nice try. But if it's an autonomous system response, then we've already established nice try. But you can't be held responsible for it, right? If I force feed you lactose, who is responsible for the resulting pain? Oh, you know the answer. Come on, you know the answer.
I want to take objection to it. I feel that it's wrong to say that you are, but I understand you are because you're doing something harmful to me.
Right.
You're doing something harmful to me.
So I'm responsible for causing you the pain of lactose intolerance.
You're responsible for causing me the fear. But you don't own my feelings, and I take exception with the word own.
Right, and that's why I've switched it to the word responsibility in a disgustingly eel-like way. In a sort of slithery lawyer logic kind of way. No, I mean, of course, I am not experiencing your feelings of lactose intolerance if I force feed you lactose, so I fully understand that.
Right.
But I am causally responsible for those feelings, and you can't change that I'm causally responsible, right? If I inject you with a bunch of lactose while you're sleeping, and you wake up doubled over in pain, you are not responsible in the same way as if you'd eaten a cheesecake. I mean, can we at least go with that? Right?
Yes.
You okay with that?
Yes.
Can we just take a moment for the cheesecake thing again? Okay. No, now her fighting spirit is up and the cheesecake is thrown aside. But, so, recognizing that you are not causally responsible for other people inflicting you harm, right? Once they have inflicted you harm, and if I don't immediately say, my God, I injected you with lactose, I'm the most evil guy in the world, I'm going to go to therapy, I'm going to figure out whatever, right? If I don't admit any fault in the matter, right, then you are now causally responsible in the future because you now understand that I'm injecting you or have the capacity to inject you with lactose, right? So the first thing that you have to do is to recognize that harm is occurring, right? Which for a lot of people is really tough because they've been heavily conditioned to be exploited by those who have authority over them. right? Because I mean, when you would go and see your parents, it wasn't like you were making that decision consciously, right? You didn't experience the harm that they were doing to you, because that's what you were trained, right? You were trained not to experience that.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, we do want to try and get people to start experiencing the harm. My great concern about the theory of forgiveness, right, to return to the original point, is that if people think that they have control over the experience of harm that other people cause in them, then they will manage their own feelings rather than getting bad people out of their life. That they will look at the bad feelings that result from being mistreated or treated with disrespect or not treated with enormous respect. They will look at the bad feelings that result from that as a problem for them to solve by doing something about their feelings. Right? In the same way that if I keep injecting you with lactose, you could say, well, I'm going to take a Zen-like approach to my pain and try and manage my symptoms rather than remove the cause. And my concern about the theory of forgiveness is that it's all about managing the symptoms of pain rather than not forgiving, getting angry, and getting these damn people out of your life. By recognizing that you can't control the feelings that being treated badly is going to evoke in you. You can only get rid of the cause.
Right, you can't control those feelings. Okay, so I agree with you. Get rid of the bad people completely and totally. Don't try and manage the feelings. But you're responsible to determine whether or not those feelings are accurate by really subjugating your values to a rigorous examination. Are my values clear? Are they about truth? Are they about honesty? Are they about justice?
Oh, I totally agree with you, but
so that's how you're responsible.
But all of that comes after you get rid of the narcotic effects of the theory of forgiveness. Right? In order for people to start examining their own values and beliefs and so on, they have to, sad but true, they have to experience some discomfort. We both know this from our own defooing, right? When we controlled our own responses and translated family visits into an argument for morality, we didn't experience discomfort. Huge levels of discomfort around our family. We'd feel irritated or negative or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But we would not experience huge levels of discomfort with our family. Once I began, not that I won or anything, I just want to talk about my own experience. Once I began to peel off these hypnotic and morphine-based layers of forgiveness and the illusion of being able to control my own emotional responses to being disrespected, to being scorned, to being minimized, put down in subtle ways, and also sometimes just directly yelled at by my mom. Once I got rid of the idea of forgiveness, then I began to experience the discomfort, right? So once we began talking about your parents and their values and your values and the disconnect, and once I began to say, when we go over to your parents' place, you vanish, right? Once I began to identify symptoms of dissociation, then you began to experience more discomfort. And I felt that my job as a husband was done. But you began to experience more discomfort. So yes, for sure, people should examine their values and they should look at them rationally, but they can't do that if they continue to be drugged into dissociation by this theory of control over their own emotions and forgiveness.
Okay, so it's my responsibility to recognize the external threats. So if there's a hot plate in front of me and I put my finger on it, I touch it, it hurts. It's my responsibility not to keep touching it because I'm going to keep getting burned. So if my parents are the external threat, it's my responsibility to recognize that they are an external threat and to stay away from them.
Agreed. All right, but let's say that, and this isn't as theoretical as it sounds. There are some genuine examples of this both throughout history and in the modern world. There are certain, and it's almost always religious beliefs, that would say that you should touch the stoveplate because you should be punished by God. Because you're evil and you have to remind yourself of the fires of hell, and so you have to self-flagellate, right? This is very common in the Middle Ages, and it's common in the Muslim world as well. Self-flagellation, beating yourself, starving yourself, whipping yourself, because it's you're bad, right? You're bad, it's your fault, and so the pain is turned into a virtue, right? That's sort of one example. But I think what's more common in the West is that we simply do not feel the pain, right? So if I touch the hot plate, if I don't feel any pain, that's really bad. And when you were going to see your parents, you felt a sort of a bit of a heavy obligation, and you kind of went to avoid the pain of...
The elastic stretching.
Yeah, we talked about this, like with Christina's parents. Like, she wouldn't see them for a week or 2 or 3, and it would be like an elastic was stretching, and then in order to relieve that tension, we'd go and see them, and then the elastic... So you were kind of like avoiding a negative experience by going to see them. It would assuage a kind of guilt. So you weren't feeling the pain of seeing them. You were feeling the tension or the stress of not seeing them, right? So in that state, it's almost like you don't feel the pain of touching the stove. And what happens is, when you haven't burnt yourself in a while, you begin to feel anxious, right? So it's like a self-mutilation thing, right? You go, and you know this from patients as well, right? That they self-mutilate and then they go away, they feel anxious, they come back, and they'll do it again, right? So that, A, they don't feel pain to begin with, and B, when they haven't had the experience of self-mutilation for a while, they'll be drawn back to it to do it again, right? So from that standpoint, I think that the stove thing is totally accurate if you feel the pain, and if you recognize that you have no control over the pain that results from touching a stove, and that you are not responsible for the pain that results from touching the stove. You are responsible for not touching the stove again.
I agree with that.
Well, then we've kind of ended up in the same place. That's good. That's good. That's progress. Because what I'm saying is that if we take the stove to be the actions of other people, right?
The external trigger.
The external trigger. If I touch the stove, I'm not responsible for the pain that results. I'm responsible for touching the stove, but once I have touched the stove, it's an autonomous nervous system response. I'm not responsible for the pain that results.
Correct, but then after you've touched it once, you should recognize that if you touch it again, you're going to be burned.
That's certainly true. I absolutely understand that. But the only reason you're not going to touch it again is because, A, you don't think that touching it is a virtue, as we talked about with the religious nuts, and also, B, that you recognize you have no control over the resulting pain.
Absolutely. You touch, you're going to hurt.
Right.
You have no control. You can't make that pain stop.
Right.
Unless you're some kind of, these people who walk on coals.
Yeah, that's a fallacy.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, actually, their feet get sweaty and there's ash over the top of the coals. Anyway, we won't get into that. But yeah, no, I mean, if you have sort of an extraordinary capacity for dissociation, if you're sociopathic fundamentally, right, then you're going to be able to do some of that stuff. But we wouldn't say that's much of an ideal, right? So we were talking about people who have leprosy, they lose feelings in their extremities, right? And they have to do what's called a VSE, a visual search for a visual scan or search of extremities to make sure that they're not cut or bleeding because they can't tell. But that's just a deviation from health. So if we recognize that when we are around certain people, right, most people, around most people, they're going to hurt us, right? Just as touching the stove, right? Now, we can't control what happens after we're around these people. They're going to hurt us. The only thing we can do is not be around these people. And if we think we can control or manage our emotional reactions to people who don't respect us, then we're going to feel that we can manage our whatever. We can go around. If we think it's virtuous to touch the stove and we can manage the responses, then we're going to try and find a way to do it and end up dissociated.
I think that we agree on several points, or at least on one key point, is that, if we're around people who are going to hurt us, we can't control the feelings of being hurt. What we can control is whether or not we will be in the presence of people who are going to hurt us. And that's how we own our own feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. We own that we can't control the responses that we have for people who hurt us. Any more than I can control the pain that results from touching a stove. And once I get that I can't control the pain of touching the stove, and there's no virtue in touching the stove, I'm not going to touch the stove.
But you are responsible for getting it.
I am responsible for getting it. I am responsible for getting that I can't control it.
And I think we agree on that.
Okay, good.
I think we agree on that.
So one of us is one. Wait, let's figure out who. That's the most important thing.
No, I agree with what you're saying. I do. I agree with what you're saying. The point that I disagreed with from the very beginning was that you said that other people own our responses.
Right, and you're quite right to question that. And I would definitely modify that to say that we are not responsible for the pain of being abused. We are responsible for getting abusers out of our life.
I agree with that completely.
Yeah, and so I think that, and of course, other people don't have direct joysticks over your emotional apparatus, right? They can't directly make you feel, except, of course, with the autonomous nervous system responses, it's pretty indistinguishable, as we talked about, injecting someone with lactose or forcing them to drink lactose and whatever, right? I mean, that there's autonomous nervous system responses of which the experience of trauma and the dissociation from trauma and the idealization of trauma through an argument for morality, you know, my parents are good, blah, blah, blah. That seems to be pretty much an autonomous nervous system response, which, again, we have less control over than we would like to think.
Yeah, that one I'm going to have to really think about.
For me, it's like learning the limits of responsibility is as important as learning the area of responsibility, right? Like if you want to map something, you have to know its borders. And so for me, self-ownership responsibility is absolutely crucial, but it is as great an error to think that we are not responsible for something that we are responsible for as it is to think that we are responsible for something that we're actually not responsible for.
I agree completely.
And
I think the key for me as a therapist is to get people to learn to trust their instincts, but to trust their instincts, i.e. the emotions, because they've done a rigorous evaluation of their values.
And the reason that...
And that's how they own their own feelings.
Right. And what happens, I think, is and again, I don't know, but based on my own experience in therapy, what happens is that when you follow these false arguments for morality, like the virtue of family or whatever, for a certain amount of time, but because they're false, you end up depressed, or you end up anxious, or with panic attacks, or something that's going on that is a negative experience. Now, prior to that negative experience going on, hopefully you can make cases for people and get them to change prior to whatever, right? You always hope that people are going to stop smoking before they get sick, or something like that. But for sure, the first thing that I had to do when I started working on this was to challenge my own assumptions about what was good and what I had control over, right? Because there's lots of stuff out there that says you have total control over your own life. If you want to make a relationship better, you should step up and make that relationship better. And I don't believe that.
I agree.
I don't believe that. I think that you have to recognize that other people are causally responsible for a lot of your emotions, and that to try and manage that is like taking morphine when you're picking up a hot bar that's burning you, that you're just going to get worse and worse and worse. And the first thing to recognize is that if you do want to own your emotions, like if you do want to have causal control over your own emotions, obviously you work on your values, but you really have to work on keeping the good people in your life and getting the bad people out of your life. And then...
But you do that by looking at your values.
You do that by looking at your values. You also do that, of course, but yeah, the values are the great narcotic of the feelings, right? The argument for morality trumps just about everything. If you can get someone to admit that going to see their abusive parents is morally good, they will always end up doing it, right? As I've always said, the argument for morality is like the strong force. It's the gravity. It is the thing that binds the universe together, right? What people agree is the good is what they will inevitably end up doing. And so the first thing that you need to do is challenge your moral assumptions, which is part of what cognitive therapy is, right? What are your core beliefs that lead you to go and see your parents, right? One of the core beliefs that you had was that Steph shouldn't enjoy his Sundays. I think that was your and it's a great thing that you met someone like Steph, because I think that it even was before me, right? So whatever core beliefs you have about the virtues and values, that's the stuff that you have to drop. But you have to first of all say that I'm not responsible for how other people make me feel. I am responsible for keeping the good people in my life and getting the bad people out of my life.
Yes.
And of course, you want to make sure that your values aren't so twisted that good people make you feel bad and bad people make you feel relieved, right? So there's some people, like, you think of some, I don't know, horribly abused goth queen or something like that she's going to walk around downtown, and some preppy-looking successful guy she's going to feel scorn and contempt for, and then some guy with a black mohawk with 1,900 piercings and, an entire world map of body tattoos, she's going to gravitate towards that guy because he's going to reflect her own emotional history and the horror, and she's not going to make the same demands for emotional health that someone else might. He's not going to look at her with sneers or contempt or whatever. So that person would have to say, I think, first of all, my values are kind of doing the wrong thing for me, right? I've become somebody who self-mutilates, right? I mean, that relief that they feel from experiencing pain is not healthy. So their values have become reversed. But I think the first thing that needs to happen is you need to peel away the arguments for morality and get people to understand that they were not responsible for the values they inherited from their parents and from their education, because that was just brutal power that was influenced over them or exercised over them. that they're not responsible for how people make them feel after due examination, but they are responsible for examining their values, right? Which is sort of what we're all about. What you're about as a therapist and what I'm about as a philosopher, you are responsible for examining your values and for not believing things that are demonstrably false and silly, like there's nothing but virtue in the realm of family or country or whatever, right? So, but the first thing you have to do is recognize where you're not responsible. You're not responsible for the family that you're born into. You're not responsible for how you're treated as a child. You're not responsible for the values that were inflicted upon you through brute coercion and control. You're not responsible for how people make you feel. You are responsible for examining your values and for not lying to yourself about all of that stuff. But I think as long as people say, well, I can control how I respond to people and I can will love and I can will forgiveness and I can will whatever, then people are going to end up trapped because they're going to end up keep wanting to touch the stove and self-mutilating and think that it's a good thing and not feel the negative, right? So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
I agree with you, and I think we started on the same page when we both said you cannot will forgiveness.
Right. So the feelings that you have around other people are they're causally responsible for them. You are not.
Right, and that's very different. And the whole reason we started this discussion was because you said they own your feelings. And
right, but I was using the Persian word own, which actually means responsibility, a causal responsibility. But I'm sorry, I should have been more clear about that. Right. Christina's not quite as up on ancient languages as I am. So
here we are an hour later. I think it was a great debate. And
all right, we'll talk to everyone this afternoon at 4. Thank you so much for listening.